and our colleagues and our friends and our comrades in Bangladesh. So thank you everybody for being here. It's a pleasure to be with you. I will start with what we call here in Canada an acknowledgement. I'll tell you a little bit more about that briefly. Basically, what we do, because we are on unceded territories that have been stolen from the original and indigenous communities of North America, of the continent, we take a moment to recognize that we are uninvited guests on this land. I happen to be joining you today from the west coast of the country known, the colonial name of Canada, which is kind of the nation state, but it is the unceded territories of different communities. They're known as the Coast Salish people. There are different nations, the Musqueam, Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and several others. If you are interested in the decolonial movements here in North America, it's worth examining their histories. We're at the point now where we're revising the colonial history of Canada, and it is not only customary, but it is important for us to challenge the structures that have rendered this country the way it is. And so it's the least we can do is to acknowledge that we are part of the settler colonial practices and institutions. And I know that in Bangladesh, there is also a fairly strong recognition of the relationship between people and land and indigeneity, and a long history of both conflict and reconciliation has taken place over decades. And so it's irrespective of where we are geographically, if we are guests on land, or we are newcomers on land, or immigrants on land, or settlers on land, it's important for us to recognize that and to understand our relationship to the original inhabitants of any land that we happen to be on. That's sort of what I want to start with. I see a picture of my dad in the background behind someone. That is a very intimidating image to stare at. Thank you. Are you the person who's supposed to introduce me, or is that just like a beautiful background of me? Okay. Anyway, so I'm very much humbled to be.
Yes, one of our co-moderators have joined from the department directly. Like in that room, we are screening the session entirely for the public.
Okay.
So
Okay.
he would be, he's our junior most moderator. His name is Tawhidul Shan, and he is the one who designed the banner. So I believe that he couldn't stop showing off.
Oh, that's great. Thank you. Thank you for the
doing.
banner. I'm humbled by it. I appreciate
Yes.
It's in the age of virtual communication and digital presence. That sort of physical manifestation in lieu of my presence in person is wonderful. Although I would have much preferred to be with you and to commune with you and to spend time with everyone. But hopefully in the near future.
And if you excuse Adel, the person who were like who was going to introduce you is amongst us. So could we please invite? Yeah. So Shubho Shen, he would like to say a few humble words about our today's guest. So Shubho, are you there?
Hello, ma'am. Sorry for the late joining.
Okay. Yeah. Please go ahead.
Ladies and gentlemen, esteemed viewers, welcome to our program today. We, the Department of Television, Film and Photography, University of Dhaka, have the privilege of hosting a distinguished guest today, guest whose expertise in media studies and Arab media has left an indelible mark on the field. It is my pleasure to introduce you to the brilliant scholar, author, and media expert, Adel Iskandar. Adel Iskandar's illustrious career is characterized by the relentless pursuit of understanding the intricate relationship between media, politics, and culture in the Arab world. With a bachelor degree in mass communication from the esteemed American University in Cairo and a PhD in communication from Columbia University, Iskandar's academic foundation is solid and extensive. Throughout his career, Iskandar has held esteemed teaching position at prestigious institutions around the globe. As a professor and researcher, he has imparted his deep knowledge of media and communication to students at renowned universities such as Georgetown University, the American University of Beirut, Northwestern University in Qatar, and the University of Texas in Austin. His commitment to fostering critical thinking and media literacy has inspired countless students and scholars in the pursuit of understanding the ever-evolving media landscape. Iskandar's the groundbreaking research delves into crucial topics such as Arab media history, the impact of satellite television, media, and popular culture, and the transformative role of social media is shaping political movements. His insightful analysis has provided invaluable perspectives on the complex dynamics between media and society in the Arab world. As an accomplished author, Iskandar has penned influential books that have garnered international recognition. His works, including Egypt in Flux, Essays on an Unfinished Revolution, and Al Jazeera, the story of the network that is rattling governments and redefining modern journalism, offer profound insights into the socio-political implication of media in the region. Iskandar's writings have become essential reference in academia, shaping the discourse on Arab media and its role in shaping public opinion. Not only Iskandar contributed to the academic sphere, but he has also been a sought-after consultant and commentator for various media outlets. Networks such as Al Jazeera English, BBC, and CNN benefited from the astute analysis and thoughtful commentary on Arab media and current events. His expertise in navigating the complexities of media landscape has made him a trusted voice in understanding the region's socio-political developments. Beyond his scholarly pursuit, Iskandar actively engages with the public thoughts, lectures, conferences, and workshops. His dedication to fostering dialogue and promoting media literacy has transcended the academic realm, enabling him to connect with diverse communities and inspires informed discussion. Ladies and gentlemen, Iskandar's contribution to media studies and his profound understanding of Arab media has cemented his reputation as an authority in the field. Today, we have the extraordinary opportunity to delve into his wealth of knowledge and expertise. The Department of Television, Film and Photography from University of Dhaka is giving a warm welcome to the esteemed guest, Adel Iskandar. Welcome, sir.
Wow. Thank you. Thank you so much, Shiva. That was very, very, very generous. And I dare say a little exaggerated, but I'm very humbled by your kind words. And it really is a delight and a pleasure to be in your midst. So yeah, let's see. I'm going to, that's a very hefty, biographical introduction that I hope I don't disappoint after that. Okay, so today what I'd like to do, and if you don't mind, I'd like to actually share my screen. Is that something that I can do? Probably can. Is this visible to everyone? Yes? Go for it. Can you give me a thumbs up? It is. It is. Okay, excellent. Okay. So what I'd like to do today is to, in light of a lot of the matters and the issues and the different topics and concepts that were raised by Shubho in his introduction, it is obviously there's too much to cover for the short time that we have together. So what I thought might be useful to do is for us to zoom in on a case study, an example, a circumstance in contemporary media broadcasting that originates from the Arab world, from the Middle East and North Africa, that has had a fairly substantial impact globally, and for us to think about it and use our understanding of this media experiment, if you will, to help us glean dynamics and circumstances that can be not seen as generalizable, but we can compare and contrast this case study to other case studies in contemporary broadcasting. So as you are probably all familiar, the history of global broadcasting and global communication in general has been largely Western-centric. The distribution of information from time immemorial has largely been unidirectional from north to south and from west to east. And that has been largely the case until the contemporary period. And I'll talk about that in light of this example more specifically. But when we think about and we talk about examples of major broadcasters, and by major, of course, that's a very relative term, but the term major, in this case, I'm using it somewhat liberally to describe networks or stations or broadcasters or media entities that have a substantial global footprint, ones that are accessible internationally, have an audience beyond the national and political borders of the nation state from which they emerge, and are impactful in the sense that they're capable of shifting public and popular opinion, not to mention the rendering that possibility for political transformation in those countries. So it should come as no mystery to many of you that precursors or examples of that historically might have been the BBC, Voice of America, CNN. CNN, of course, has claimed to fame probably before your time was during the first Gulf War in 1991. That was really what made CNN a substantial broadcaster internationally. And of course, BBC has a long history that dates back to the World Service Radio, which originated in the 1930s. So in the period prior to the emergence of Nazism and fascism in Europe. But with that being said, those are major broadcasters with substantial footprint as far as distribution goes and political and social impact. So when we think about broadcasters from the global south that I'm not going to say have an equivalent degree of distribution impact and influence, but at the very least, by modern day standards, their distribution is widespread and are notable in their impact on social and cultural mores in their region and beyond. I would say Al Jazeera is probably one of the more substantial broadcasters from the global south. So we'll talk a little bit about Al Jazeera, its history, its background, how it emerged, why it emerged, who brought it into being. And then we're going to talk a little bit about how it's changed over the years, the role that it's played in relation to various political topographies, both in its region and beyond. And then hopefully it'll help us understand its trajectory, where it's heading, what it means, and really how that how that impacts us. And when I say us, I mean I invite you to look at this discussion from two positions. The first is a member of an engaged citizenry, member of a public, informed public, an individual who is capable of deciphering in a media literate way the difference between politicized propaganda and socially responsible reporting. And I also invite you to listen to this presentation from another perspective, from the perspective of someone who might engage in media scholarship further down the line, or if you're doing so now, it's something that might be helpful. And by that, I mean looking at this and thinking about the theoretical, conceptual dynamics of how media entities operate as institutions, as employers, as producers of discourse and information. So I want you to put on two hats, right? And you can switch between them depending on how you feel at any given moment. So you're an informed member of the citizenry of the public, and you are like an academic or scholar or researcher who wants to better understand why these structures are the way they are. Okay, so the reason why I'm calling it the blurred lines of mainstream and alternative media, we're going to revisit later, but I want you to keep that in mind. Okay, I want a question to reverberate in your conscious or subconscious for whether or not you feel that Al Jazeera is a mainstream news organization or an alternative news organization. Okay, there's no right answer. There's just how you feel at any given moment throughout my presentation. Let's backtrack a little bit and talk about the geography of the region from which Al Jazeera originates and emerges. So this is a map of the quote unquote Middle East and North Africa. It's a geographic region. The Middle East is, as a term, is a colonial construct. And, I'm not going to belabor it, but it is a geographic region that has served British colonial and French colonial objectives in the region. And so it is a highly problematic term. Nevertheless, it's been in circulation long enough that it's taken on a life of its own and has become a defining political configuration that helps us identify the relationship between different locales. The reason why I'm showing you this map is to show you the relative proximity between various countries. So if you can see my cursor here, my cursor visible, the moving cursor right here. Right here, there's a very, very small peninsular entity or state. This is Qatar. For those of you who are familiar with the geography, I'm sorry about that, but for those who are not, I think it's useful to see the relationship between all those countries. The countries that are most sizable and populous are the ones that you can see here. Most of the countries that are in color, with the exception of a few, are also part of the quote-unquote Arab world. The Arab world is comprised of 22 countries. Those countries are countries that have an official, Arabic as an official language, and are members of the multinational organization called the Arab League. Membership in that is also political and depends on if you're in the good books of the more powerful countries in that region. But you can see here that Qatar is a fairly small peninsula in the Arabian/Persian Gulf, depending on which side of it you're on. Those names are also politicized. Nevertheless, so Qatar is right here, and Al Jazeera's main headquarters broadcast out of Qatar. So you can automatically see that it is part of the Gulf countries, the Gulf Cooperation Council. It is also a country with a fairly small geographic location and is surrounded by relatively powerful, or by comparison, powerful countries in terms of population size, density, as well as political, social, cultural history, civilizational power as well. So it is a fairly small country with a small locale, and perceivably until recently, fairly small political impact in the region. Now, if we were to situate Qatar, I mean, this is kind of a zooming in, situate Qatar in relation to its neighbors. This is where Qatar is. Doha is the capital. Of course, many of you might know more about Qatar this year because a few months ago, 6 or 7 months ago, it was home to the World Cup, the Football World Cup. So for those of you who watched, that was really kind of a centerpiece. But it was also a very, very politicized World Cup. And for those of you who followed coverage of the World Cup itself, you can see how the combination of political, social, cultural, and religious identity, and the sort of the promotion of the country in the global public sphere became two sort of polarities in a complicated spectrum, and a really sort of intriguing waltz between the West and the East, between the North and the South, between those with power and those who are perceived to not having power, between countries that are on the rise with high GDPs and countries that are on a decline economically, such as Western Europe and other places. So Doha or Qatar becomes a really, really interesting place in relation to its neighbors. Just by merely looking at this, you can see that Qatar is sandwiched between two very powerful and very influential countries, Iran in the north and Saudi Arabia in the southwest. And those two countries have, for as many of you know, or all of you might know, have been at political odds at least since 1979, when the Islamic Republic came into being in Iran. And of course, that political sort of confrontation, quagmire, however you want to call it, standoff, has left Qatar not only sandwiched in a geographic sense, but also politically. It is very easy for Qatar to see itself as threatened by both in various ways. So it's had to pivot and situate itself in relation to those two polarities in complicated ways. And one could look very, very closely at and examine various points in contemporary history and how Qatar has negotiated that relationship between those, its relationship between those two countries. And in some cases served as an intermediary or a mediator between them. Now, so thus far we've talked about everything except the sort of where power is situated and located. This is a very dated little sort of diagrammatic map that shows several things that I feel are quite important. The first is a demographic distribution of the two major religious communities in the region, the Sunnis and the Shias, and showing the proportions between them. It also shows where US military bases happen to be, whether it's naval or air bases. And it also shows which countries possess the largest reserves in natural gas and oil, or sort of oil and gas, or gas. So you can, if you zoom in a little bit, I don't know if this is visible to everybody here, but if we pay attention to Qatar, we see here that it has 25,000 billion cubic meters of natural gas. And this again is dated. It is about twice that much. So this is a very, very substantial amount. The nearest country is probably Saudi Arabia with just 7,000. Okay, or actually no, we're looking at 29,000 in Iran. But now, since then, Qatar has eclipsed that. Qatar today is recognized as the country with the second largest natural gas reserves after Russia, which means that Qatar, given its size and its very minuscule population, has one of the highest GDPs in the world. And of course, it is also home to one very, very important and major military base, the Udeid military base, which was, and I know for those of you who follow or know enough about Al Jazeera and perhaps its coverage of the war in Iraq and the war in Afghanistan and others, you understand the sort of the nuances of the way in which Al Jazeera covers the United States and its military adventures in the region, and how critical and hostile it is of those military actions. But surprisingly, and perhaps ironically, just a few kilometers away from Al Jazeera's headquarters is the largest military base in the region, and in fact, the home to what is called the Central Command of the US military, from which most of the aerial bombardment of Iraq was being launched while Al Jazeera was critiquing it on its airwaves. So you could see this really complicated kind of relationship that Qatar is in relation to having the protection of the US military base. And by that, I mean its protection from both the Iranian kind of ambitions, political ambitions, and protection from Saudi military ambitions. Okay. So having the US there is meant to preserve the sovereignty of that very, very small and potentially vulnerable state, and to protect its assets. Now, understandably, the US has, as it typically does, its military pursuits are often tied to its economic interests. And so the ambitions of securing access to natural gas explains the presence of military bases in that region. So what does that all mean? Let's backtrack a little bit and figure out how Al Jazeera came into being. It should come as no surprise. I mean, for most of you here, throughout your lives, Al Jazeera has been in existence. But that's not always the case. Al Jazeera came into being in 1996 tell you a little bit about how that commenced. So, prior to 1996, BBC World Service Radio, which broadcasts in multiple languages. I imagine there's a Bangla service, right? There is, correct? Am I right? Is it still running? I know that they've downsized and shut down a lot of their services, but I imagine.
Right now, I think the English version is very popular in here, not the Bangla actually. Yeah, but there was a very short period that there were some, Mahir Sattar made some Bangla versions or Bangla segments, I guess. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you for that clarification. So yes, I mean where English is a common language, BBC definitely has a substantial impact, or has at least until recently. When BBC decided to launch television broadcasting in a language other than English. Of course, BBC broadcasts in multiple terrestrial and now satellite networks in the UK. But when they decided to broadcast in another language, their first objective was to reach the Arab world because of, again, the major interest in that region. And so they launched, or they intended to launch, an Arabic language service. So these are actually screenshots from the very first English language broadcast. Now that station, because BBC, as many of you know, is a public broadcaster funded largely by the licensing fees. So the only way to generate sufficient funds to broadcast in another language through a televised service was by fundraising for it. And so this was supposed to be a collaboration between BBC and a Saudi company called Orbit. Now Orbit exists as a major media conglomerate, but at the time, it was supposed to be a collaboration to utilize the sort of news reputation of BBC and couple that with the funding from Saudi donors, and you get a show, or you get a program. Okay, and it sounded like a fairly agreeable idea. However, the journalistic standards at BBC were found to be quite at odds with the Saudi funder. One of the first during the first days of programming, there was immediately a rift, and that rift came into being as a result of a special documentary program dedicated to the topic of public beheadings in Saudi Arabia. BBC editorial team, all of whom were situated in London, decided that this was an important issue to discuss. It was a human rights violation, and it was kind of a scandalous thing. These Saudi funders caught wind of the possibility of that program, and decided to call on its discontinuation, or that it not air. The folks in the switchboard decided that it's probably a good idea not to listen to their Saudi funders and to assert their editorial independence. And so the program went to air. And within maybe an hour or two, the channel was taken off the air, and it never went back on air. So that was the end of BBC's in Arabic language broadcast, literally at its inception. It was kind of a stillborn project. And so they pulled the plug financially, and every member of that team was left jobless. And of course, it meant that the idea itself never came to fruition, but the idea continued to live on. And so that's when the former Emir of Qatar, not the sitting Emir, but his father, Sheikh Hamad bin Khalifa Al Thani, decided that this would be, and who had also toppled, just kind of incidentally, he had toppled his own father in a bloodless coup in the country, and decided to kind of shift gears in the country. And one of the things that he decided to do was to hire a nucleus of the staff from that BBC Arabic language program in London that had become defunct, and relocate them to Qatar to start the equivalent of BBC, but on Arab territory. And so guess what that network was called? Rather than BBC, it was called Al Jazeera. So the first broadcast of the network was in 1996. This is a screenshot, not necessarily of the first broadcast, but the early days of the station. So it's been many, many years of Al Jazeera. Interestingly, when I first started looking at it, it was essentially during that time. I was kind of a student, an undergraduate student, and then a graduate student, and so I was following it during that time, and I can't stop following it. It's just one of those things that keeps morphing and changing in such intriguing ways. Anyhow, so 1996, it came into being. For those of you who know a little bit about media in North America, it was also the same year that Fox News Channel, the mostly right-wing conservative platform and broadcaster in the US, also made its name. So between 1996 and for the next decade, really compelling things started happening in the region and beyond, and Al Jazeera happened to find itself in the right place at the right time. So a few years later, we had the tragic attacks of 9/11, September 11th in North America, in New York, and in the American Eastern Seaboard. And during that time, Al Jazeera was situated in such a way that the ensuing wars that were launched by George W. Bush as an attempt, as a reprisal, if you will, or as a kind of a retaliation against the attack, both in Afghanistan and in Iraq, happened to be in places where Al Jazeera had very substantial broadcast footprint. They had major bureaus and major broadcasters and journalists, entire teams of people. So they were there reporting on the ground at a time when most Western journalists were not. But they also became the network that the Taliban and Al-Qaeda at the time were using to relay their messages to potential supporters. So when bin Laden had messages to distribute to the world, he would send those cassettes. I know that's kind of like an obsolete term, but back in the day, there was a thing called a VHS tape. So the VHS tape would show up in the mail, or somebody would hand deliver it and get it to Al Jazeera. Al Jazeera would broadcast it, and of course, it would get exclusive coverage, and it would be picked up by other stations. So Al Jazeera very quickly went from being that station over there in the Arab world for those Arabic-speaking people to a station that is reporting from all these hot zones, these places where really compelling things were going on, including where US military interventions were unfolding. And, one thing led to another. So whether it's, access to various political groups or the actual conflicts themselves. So for instance, in the first days of the war in Afghanistan, this is in 2001, this is literally a screenshot from the first strikes on Afghanistan in 2001. And you can see the damage to the infrastructure and all these different things. Now, of course, many people in Afghanistan believe that this was kind of collective punishment so against an entire population of people for the actions of a few individuals. At any rate, because Al Jazeera happened to be there, you can see like the top left-hand corner says Al Jazeera exclusive. The same is said in Arabic on the right. And you begin to see how reporting was very different from the reporting of, let's say, CNN or Fox News or BBC or others, who were really very much focused on the military operation itself, like the armaments and the submarines and the aircrafts and their technology and all these different things. So the angle and the perspective on coverage and journalism became a real sort of defining feature of how Al Jazeera covered things. Now, when it comes to these types of conflicts and wars, Al Jazeera situated itself from the standpoint of the victims of those who were being attacked. So the precarious, the subjugated, the people on the receiving end of these conflicts. It just so happened, didn't just so happen, by design it happened, but you had a situation where it was primarily the West launching wars against countries in the East or in the South. And so that dynamic helped reinforce the view that Al Jazeera is the voice of the voiceless, or the voice of the disenfranchised, or the voice of global Muslims, and all these different sort of dynamics because of that situation. A few, 2 years later, in March of 2003, we began to see the buildup to the Iraq War. And for those of you who might remember or know a little bit about that, this was a war that was mobilized quite heavily by the United States. And there was a very, very substantial and robust anti-war movement that spread across the world. It's a very, very unpopular war from its outset, except for in the United States. I would argue that even in the UK, it was quite unpopular, but there was a very, very large anti-war movement. Al Jazeera, like many other networks, global networks, decided to cover it in that manner. But Al Jazeera had a unique vantage point in that, unlike any other station, they also happened to have bureaus, offices, reporters on the ground in Iraq, in, I would say, most of the major cities. So as soon as the war was launched, they were there to document the death and destruction caused by it. For those of you who might remember, George W. Bush at the time called the first sort of attacks the shock and awe strategy, that you basically like bomb the place to smithereens and then, hopefully scare people into submission. Ironically, that shocking people into submission hasn't worked neither in Afghanistan nor in Iraq, as in both cases, now we know over 20 years or 30 years later that the United States has withdrawn from both countries and left those countries both in a perilous state and with warlords not much more pleasant than what they showed up to uproot or to remove. But at any rate, so Al Jazeera happened to be there, and you can see here, these are the coffins of people who were killed by the bombardment. And of course, the numbers and the photos and the videos and all of that footage kept on coming. So when Al Jazeera was on the other side of that conflict, they were on the receiving end of the attacks. Now, things became really interesting because when if we were to pan out a little bit and think about a time where satellite television is now beaming into people's homes, and we're able to see that juxtaposition, those two images adjacent to each other. You can flick the channel between Fox News and Al Jazeera, and you could see two representations of the same conflict. On Fox News and some of the other US networks, the United States is this liberating country that's bringing democracy and uprooting authoritarianism. And you watch Al Jazeera, and the United States is a bloodthirsty criminal country that is essentially decimating anything that exists in the world, right? And both of those narratives kind of serve a particular purpose. And both of them are rooted in a particular ideological position in their respective locale. Then, with that being said, Al Jazeera now goes from being the station that broadcasts in Arabic to Arabic people or Arabic speaking people to being a global brand, essentially, a brand that is recognizable, that's familiar, that people kind of hear about, even if they don't know enough about it, but a recognizable brand. And as a recognizable brand, it became quite self-evident that the potential audience for Al Jazeera is far greater than the 22 Arab countries and the 300 million Arabic-speaking persons living in the region and beyond. Did I say 300,000? I said 300 million, or between 300 and 400 million people who speak Arabic. So how to reach English-speaking audiences, and why to reach English-speaking audience? At the time, of course, it's a source of political influence. To be able to get your message to the world is one way to perhaps protect yourself from potential adversaries. And so Al Jazeera English was launched in 2006, sorry. So this is 10 years after the Arabic language broadcaster was launched. Now, with that comes a major shift in the way things are done. The cost of launching Al Jazeera English was very substantial. We're talking about literally hundreds of thousands of dollars. Hundreds hundreds of millions of dollars. Thousands is minuscule by modern standards, but hundreds of millions of dollars. And of course, opening bureaus in multiple locales, offices all over the world, thousands of staff members. So this was not your kind of small operation that's kind of struggling to make ends meet. You compare, for instance, and I say that because as someone who comes from Egypt, and I know I'm talking to you guys in Bangladesh, we have a lot of things in common. For us, scale and financing is a big deal. So to imagine what you can do with, say $400-500 million as far as broadcasting, you can kind of overhaul the entire continent's media operations. So we can, we can probably do a lot more with a lot less. But nevertheless, the objective was to broadcast from 4 different major sites around the clock. So I think the main offices were in Washington, D.C., London, Qatar, and Kuala Lumpur. And so on a 24-hour cycle, you would move the sort of the time zones between those 4 locales. So it's prime time in one place every time. And you would shift from place to place to place. So if you tune in at, say, midnight here in Canada, it would be prime time in Kuala Lumpur. So you would get, news from South Asia and Southeast Asia, and that would be like the prime time. And then if you tune in your nighttime, it'll be our prime time. So you get news from Washington, D.C., which covers the entire kind of Western hemisphere. And as you can see, that's kind of the way the cycle goes. And the objective was to have the content be global and to familiarize ourselves with information that's coming from all these different places. Now, it's a really, really good idea because in the era of siloed communication, when we talk about transnational broadcasting or global broadcasting, we assume that global just means that it crosses borders, right? But this was a different approach. This is basically trying to bring folks in North America content that's generated from other places, to bring, let's say, North America and Western Europe and kind of West Africa to people in Southeast Asia. Like the objective is to kind of cross-pollinate, discursively and what have you. But at the end of the day, it was also a very, very well-funded project, which meant that the reporters and the journalists were, for all intents and purposes, elite journalists, covering stories in a way that typically focused on the political agendas of both governments and their adversaries. However, one of the things that they did do quite well, and I think to their credit as a network, is that they focused on hiring local staff to cover those stories. So it would be unreasonable for them to have someone in Bangladesh covering Bangladesh, for instance, who isn't from Bangladesh, or someone from India who isn't Indian. But it does happen, of course. In their local, usually it's someone who is situated. And so that approach was supposed to be kind of like a nativistic view on these places. And the assumption is that they will bring to the forefront issues with nuance, with complexity, and with detail. But if we know anything about this kind of reporting, I'm not defending in any way foreign correspondency. I find that to be quite problematic in its own way. But because we all know people in our countries that we disagree with, right? It really strongly depends on who it is that you choose to hire to represent the stories from that country. So the decision of who's going to be bureau chief, who's going to be the primary reporter, who's going to be the senior correspondent, who's going to do the editing, all of that is really critical. Are they in favor of the government? Are they opposed to the government? What their political leanings might be? All those things become really, really delicate. So, and then of course the question becomes, what does it mean to be objective? Is objectivity a thing? Should news reporting be nonpartisan, or can it be political in some ways? Is journalism meant to want to change things? Is there a social responsibility element to it? Is there a public good that's being acted upon? Or is it just like, just give me the news as is, kind of bare bones, the what, where, who, when, and why? So those are the types of the things that were being negotiated and discussed. So from then, my slide is okay. So from there, I'm moving sort of chronologically. So English language station launches, becomes a global phenomenon, and then shortly thereafter, we begin to, not shortly thereafter, but like a good 4 or 5 years later, we begin to see massive uprisings across the Arab world. These are just screenshots from the different protest movements in Libya, and Egypt, and Tunisia, in Yemen, and Bahrain, and all of those become, again, further affirmation and further kind of attention drawn to Al Jazeera, because again, they happen to be the major broadcaster in the region, with reporters and journalists and folks on the ground, aerial drones, like just they have the technology, they have the means, they have the funding to be able to cover these incidents and these uprisings in a way that that humbles their competitors. The CNNs and the BBCs simply don't have the funding, nor the expertise, nor even the kind of the insurance policies to allow the reporters to go to potential war zones and risk their lives. However, unfortunately, folks who are from those countries become expendable, and they end up bearing the brunt of those situations, which is why in many instances it is the local reporters covering these uprisings that end up being arrested and killed. So the toll that it's taken on local journalists is quite substantial, whether they work for Al Jazeera or any of the other Arabic language networks. So as you should be starting to see how Al Jazeera Arabic or English is all about sort of capacity building. With every event, with every incident, with every news dynamic, as a catastrophe unfolds or a conflict or a war or any dynamic, Al Jazeera begins to build steam, get stronger, get more visibility, and the brand grows and expands and has wider reach. Now, it is no surprise to any of you that many of these uprisings have long since kind of been eclipsed, and at least three of them have turned into substantial civil conflicts and major wars. One of them is the Syrian war, which unfortunately continues to rumble on. There are ebbs and flows in it, but it continues to unfold in Syria. And the country is partitioned, with millions of people displaced both internally and externally, a huge refugee crisis, and just the cost to life and resources and land and everything else has been so substantial. Having said that, Al Jazeera was essentially at the front line of this war. The front line to the extent that we're talking about neighborhoods and cities and towns and villages. Al Jazeera had reporters all over those. And in many instances, the reporters were not actually reporters, they were members of various communities and in some instances, even warring factions. The distribution of equipment, satellite uplinks, cameras, audio recorders, all of those things in some regards were facilitated by Al Jazeera to try and capture conflict live, the war live, neighborhood by neighborhood, street by street. And a lot of this sometimes it would be a live feed from someone's phone, for instance, and that would go to air and broadcast all around the world. So Al Jazeera had a front seat in the Syrian war. Many argue that front seat served the political ambitions of one group at the expense of another, that it was very much oppositional. It was opposed to Bashar al-Assad and the Ba'athist regime in Syria. And I would say that there's nothing controversial about saying that. That was really quite clearly the position of the network. But anyhow, that just kind of explains to you how they're in the right place at the right time. So the uprisings happened in 2011. Everybody's paying attention to Al Jazeera. They're like, oh my goodness, what's going on? It's an English language network. So the only place where they could not have access was in the United States. There were rules and regulations related to access to foreign broadcasters in the country. And so Al Jazeera's main sort of entity that governs it, I should say, it should be clear at this point that Al Jazeera's funding comes entirely from the Qatari government. It is an undisclosed amount of money that ends up being spent on Al Jazeera every year with the approval of the either a royal court or perhaps even the Emir of Qatar himself. So these are very, very large figures, and in many instances it feels like a bottomless pit. That a lot of money is being spent, and very little money is being generated through advertising or anything else. So this is a continuing method. Okay, I think am I going over time? I am. I'm a little long-winded. Am I still okay?
It's perfectly all right. As someone in your status said that we can listen to you for hours. So it's up to you. As long as you want to talk, it's all yours. Yeah.
You really don't want to listen to me for hours.
Yes, I
Would
want
be
to listen.
miserable.
And I
Okay.
believe my students will follow me duly. Yeah.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you for your patience. Okay, so Al Jazeera America became a project to bring Al Jazeera broadcasting to the United States, and it was tailored in such a way to appeal to US audiences specifically. To launch that network, it cost about $500 million to purchase the rights to broadcast in the country, and it cost about that much to set up the operation. So we're really talking about almost $1 billion to set up a broadcaster in the United States. Those numbers are really, I mean, you should be just astounded, like, my goodness, $1 billion to broadcast. So that was the single largest media investment at the outset, if you will, and one that was not a profit generating model. So no, very limited advertising. There's really no commodity to sell, and no sort of advertising structure in place. So this is just news to people for free for all intents and purposes. Anyhow, so the network started in 2012 in the US, and really did some quite remarkable coverage, but unfortunately it wasn't able to break into the market share. By that, I mean, it wasn't successful at playing the ratings game, because that's how things operate in the United States. You measure audiences based on number of eyeballs on any particular show. And so the numbers were quite small. The sort of liberal progressive circles were very much intrigued, and so it had loyal followings, and I should say maybe even cult followings in small communities around the country. But overall, it wasn't large enough to compete with any of the other networks. They would beat some of the other networks, from time to time, but it was too rare to justify the continuation. And then it also coincided with people moving online for their news. So for people to switch on their cable or switch on their TVs and flick through the channels in that sort of old school way was no longer kind of the appealing thing to do. And instead, people were turning to small video packages. As you know, right nowadays, most of the news that we get, the video news that we get, is online, and it's circulated through social media, and it's short clips. Of course, we've advanced since then. Like, people are watching news clips on Instagram stories and TikTok and what have you. But back then, people were starting to transition towards short YouTube videos and short kind of, I don't know if Facebook was, yeah, Facebook video. There were like short videos on Facebook. So that wasn't the most ideal experiment. A lot of money was spent, and then eventually, a few years later, Al Jazeera America had to fold. So they shut down, and the project didn't really go particularly well. Now, what does that mean as far as the family of networks? This is a relatively dated diagram that shows different stations, documentary channels, dedicated channels for the Balkans or for Turkey or for Egypt or for wherever. They're the top left-hand corner, for those of you who can read the Arabic script. Those used to be the names of the sports networks. So Al Jazeera 1, Al Jazeera Sports 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Today, those are no longer called Al Jazeera. They've been rebranded, and now they're called beIN Sports. So for those of you who know beIN, It is essentially a branch of Al Jazeera that's been rebranded. And that too is a very clever rebrand, because if you have a stigmatized or negative view of Al Jazeera, you don't necessarily have to look at Al Jazeera when you're watching your sports. You kind of veer a little bit, and it just looks like an apolitical sports network. But it is nevertheless part of the family of stations that is Al Jazeera. So here there might be like 15 or 20 channels. In reality, they're up, over 50 or 60 channels. So really, we're talking about a fairly sizable family of networks, arguably a conglomerate of networks. So that brings me to the question: is Al Jazeera a mainstream or an alternative media organization? Now, for those of you who think you know about mainstream news, I'm not going to define it for you. I think you probably have some kind of built-in ideas of what mainstream means. I'm not going to spend time doing that. I'm going to focus on the definition of the other word, alternative, to see if this criteria fits what we've described thus far. So this comes from John Downing, a notable scholar of alternative media. I like his description of alternative or radical media, and we're going to go through that and then see how applicable, if at all, this is to Al Jazeera. So the first that he says is alternative media should or need to have a relationship to a social movement. If there's no relationship to a social movement, then they don't have any bearings, so they don't have a committed position that is alternative. The second one is uniquely democratic in their operations. So meaning that there's a deliberative discussion that happens within the network that helps decide what is the more appropriate or what is the most advantageous way to do. So it is democratic in its operation. The third is that it is non-hierarchical. Hierarchical meaning that there's a sort of a chain of command, kind of like the way the military operates. There's a managing editor and an assignment editor, and all those folks who are in these different roles, and this person dictates this person dictates this person. Non-hierarchical means that it is mostly horizontal, which allows people to be a lot more flexible and dynamic in the way they do things. So for instance, you want to cover a story that your editor feels is not so important. You're like, let me just take that risk. I'm going to go cover it and I'll come back. So there's room to have these discussions that everybody contributes to the editorial policy. Everybody contributes to how stories are defined. Everybody gets credit, perhaps in a manner that is equivalent to their contributions. And that they are perceived as counter-hegemonic in nature. So what does that mean? It means that when they produce content, the viewers look at them and say, this looks like it's critiquing those in power. It may not be, but at least it looks like, right? So those, in my opinion, are the more salient 4 characteristics of alternative media. And you can take those 4 characteristics and apply them to any news broadcaster or network or media entity that you like. There may be a Bangladeshi news network that you're like, okay, and you're arguing amongst yourselves. You're like, oh, it's alternative. No, it's not alternative. It's mainstream. It belongs to the government. No, it doesn't belong to the government. That discussion, you can very easily kind of unpack it, and you may not have agreement. The same people can be looking at these criteria and answer them differently. So when we look at Al Jazeera, it seemed initially that they had no real relationship to a social movement. They were primarily counter-hegemonic. So that last point, that they challenged hegemony, but they were also part of a hegemonic structure. That they were broadcasting from one of the most powerful and wealthiest countries in the region that has its own sort of hegemony in some regard. That they were perhaps democratic in their discussions, but not entirely. Non-hierarchical. I think people who work there would probably disagree. They say, no, actually there's a hierarchy in place. There's a station manager and there are assignment editors, and there are folks who take decisions, and sometimes those decisions are not agreeable to everyone. Now, where do we see this best? We see this best when there's a conflictual situation. This is a quote from my colleague my colleague El Nawawi and my book that's now extremely outdated from 2002 about Al Jazeera. So the question that we asked is, do Qatari officials genuinely believe in freedom of information, or are they using Al Jazeera as a public relations tool to enhance their country's image overseas? That's been many years now. And I think the question is still valid, unfortunately. Like, is Al Jazeera, a political tool, a public relations tool to promote Qatar, or is it actually an independent news organization? I'll give you a great example of that. These two are screenshots that I got from various points in the last few years. So, if for those of you who don't know, there was a political standoff between Saudi Arabia and Qatar and a few other countries in the Gulf. They strongly and staunchly disagreed. Several countries staunchly disagreed with Qatar's foreign policy, especially in relation to Islamist groups in the region, and Al Jazeera's coverage of many of those groups, as well as the regimes in the region. And so they decided to embargo Qatar socially, culturally, economically, financially, and in various other ways, closing airspace to not allow Qatari aircraft to fly through, or any other aircraft for that matter. So all kinds of restrictions imposed on Qatar. And as you remember the map, once you are surrounded by Saudi Arabia and all these countries on all sides, an embargo against you can be quite suffocating. Nevertheless, the Qataris stood their ground, and in the process, over a span of 3 years during that embargo, the Al Jazeera dedicated its coverage so staunchly and so critically to leveling a real sort of character assassination against the crown prince of Saudi Arabia, and to target the royal family, and critiquing the government of Saudi Arabia and its allies in the region, including the United Arab Emirates. And we start seeing reports like the one in the bottom left-hand corner. So, complete mockery, Saudi Arabia condemned over Khashoggi's here. So anyway, they're basically, this is, there's more to the story than this, but Khashoggi, for those of you who don't know, is a very famous Saudi journalist who was killed, who was slaughtered and really brutally, and the story doesn't need to be recounted here, in a Saudi consulate in Turkey. And in the process, there was an investigation. The investigation found some of the closest persons to the Saudi crown prince have been involved with that killing. And so Al Jazeera during that time milked that story to the last drop. There was a significant amount of coverage. In addition to that, the very, very brutal Saudi war in Yemen became the subject of lots of Al Jazeera critique. And really, Al Jazeera started dedicating specific, like an entire section to criticizing Saudi Arabia. Everything from Saudi investments overseas, really just like unpacking every little detail about the Saudi government and critiquing them. Fast forward 3 years, and there is a rapprochement between the Saudis and their allies on one end and the Qataris, and eventually they agree and they rescind the embargo, and everything becomes hunky-dory. And practically overnight, it's almost like you flick the switch. Al Jazeera discontinues its negative coverage of Saudi Arabia, and it becomes the best of pals. Now, when you see that, when you see that incredible shift in tone, it's very difficult to assume that the broadcaster is actually independent. Because if they are independent, if the editorial policy is not being dictated or not being generated by the offices of power, then the coverage would not shift so substantially. In another instance, you've got a dedicated station. One of Al Jazeera's stations is Al Jazeera Egypt, or Live from Egypt, which was very, very critical of the military regime there. As a part of reconciliation with the Egyptian government, currently under the military regime, Al Jazeera effectively shut down the operation and kind of closed shop after it had gotten 10 million followers on Facebook. I don't know how many millions of followers, but overnight you flick the switch and it's gone. So obviously there are many people in a position to control the levers of the station to respond to various challenges as they unfold. Now, bring this a little bit closer to home for you guys. You're probably all familiar with all the prime minister's men. I happened to learn about it. I'm cheating, right? Because I can't claim that I knew this documentary until Gopa mentioned it to me. But I went back and watched it, and it was one of those really very, very interesting. And of course, sure, everybody has an opinion about it. It's a subject of debate. It's had repercussions. It's been watched by millions of people. I get all that, and the expose is intriguing, and it's shot in this really cool way. It looks like they're peering over people's phones. Anyway, so all this stuff is really, really cool. And Al Jazeera, because of the very, very deep pockets, it's capable of sending people in places that no other broadcaster can. But incidentally, it also raises questions about what the political repercussions of the pursuit of this type of reporting might be. Who is generating it, for what reason, and what the interests are. Now, I'm no way questioning the legitimacy of the reporting or the veracity of the journalism or even the findings themselves. But to invest funds and resources to pursue a story like this is not an arbitrary matter. It is actually a calculated matter. And the question becomes, why this story and not any other? Not in Bangladesh's case specifically, but in any and all circumstances. You have a finite amount of money. Why is this story important? Why is it being pursued? Whose purpose does it serve? And who does that? Now, again, as we know, power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. But nevertheless, the decision to address and discuss things matters more in some cases at the expense of others. A great example of that would be the following. We know, as the case in many circumstances, that there are lots of really interesting stories to pursue inside Qatar. For example, Qatar is at the forefront of the negotiations, or had been at the forefront of the negotiations between the United States, Western powers, and the Taliban before the Taliban took over. And Taliban continue to have offices in Qatar. It would be interesting to have a documentary that shows, the inner workings of hotel discussions between members of the Taliban and Qatari officials and U.S. officials before the Taliban took over. It would be great to do that, but that documentary doesn't get done. Why doesn't it get done? Because there's no political will for it. It happens to be literally in Al Jazeera's backyard. Much easier to get to than to fly to Kuala Lumpur and Singapore and go back and forth to all these different places to pursue a story. But stories are decided because they serve particular purposes. And I think that's the point that I want to drive home, that the assumption that there is kind of a very pure innocence in the decision making that happens over which story should be pursued in what way, and whether or not it makes it to air is a different thing. For years, the war against Yemen, for instance, the Gulf, so the Saudi, Emirati, and at the time also Qatari war in Yemen was not being covered on Al Jazeera. There was literally a media blackout. But as soon as the Saudis fell out of faith with the Qataris, the war was being covered meticulously. Now that there's kind of an agreement between the Saudis and the Qataris, the war is now back again in its black box. And so this is the kind of thing that I want to raise. So if we go back to the definition of what is independent, what is alternative, is there a relationship with social movement? Is it democratic? Is it non-hierarchical? Is it counter-hegemonic all the time? Some of those questions become more complicated. So I want to leave you with this question. The objective is to leave you pondering rather than, give you an answer. And I think it's perfectly comfortable not to have all the answers, but the contrary is that this is a constant contemplation and revisiting so that we can understand these media phenomena and their implications for populations, for communities, and for states. I thank you for your attention. I'm sorry to have gone a little bit longer, and I welcome any questions that you may have.
Thank you very much, Adel. This was a very interesting presentation that you shared with us. So now let us open the floor for questions. So yes, first give him an applause like Barton is doing. Everyone. Yeah, thank you very much. Yes. So now if you have any question or comment on this talk today, please feel free to write to us, or you can just unmute and ask your question. Sean, the banner man, do you have any question for our speaker today?
Good evening, Adel. Can you hear me?
Yes, I hear you perfectly. Thank you.
So I had a question about, we all know about Al Jazeera and their strategy of putting themselves against the government, especially those who are in power for the long time. This helps them to gain massive popularity because inevitably a large number of people are already disenchanted about the government. So my question is, does the non-Arab countries fail for this scheme? Can you please answer in the light of all the prime ministers meant?
I think my cat says hello.
Yep.
Honestly, I think it's important not to sort of articulate the differences as being like Arab or non-Arab. In all frankness, I think every country and every population has its own dynamics. Al Jazeera well, first of all, it should be fairly obvious to all of us that a country like Qatar has the means, the capabilities, and the interest to be a major player on the global scene. Back when Mohammed Nawawi and myself worked on the book about Al Jazeera, the Qatari officials were very camera shy. They didn't like to talk. They just didn't know how to articulate themselves in relation to like global politics. But since then, Qatar has been branding itself, if you will. And their objective is to be more influential, more involved, more present, and they're leveraging their influence around the world. One of the ways in which they've tried to leverage their influence is by creating a strong psychic bond between Muslims around the world through the view of themselves as disenfranchised and subjugated members of a global South that needs to be kind of saved and rescued, and that their adversaries are plenty and everywhere. And so that is a very resonant message for a lot of Muslims who are struggling economically, politically, socially, whether they are struggling because their governments are authoritarian, or they're struggling because their financial situation is becoming more and more dire, or they're struggling because they are mistreated as a result of Islamophobia as diasporic communities in the West. Whatever struggle they're happening to face, Al Jazeera is definitely like playing into that and working on that. So that message works for a lot of people. Is it authentic? Perhaps it is. But the question that is, I think, is more compelling is whether or not that message will prevail against all the other dynamics that exist. So, for example, what happens when we realize that the Qatari government has, informal political relations with Israel? What happens when we come to terms with the fact that they have a US military base in their country that is quite substantial and is the launching pad for exactly the wars that they are critiquing? So as soon as we begin to see the contradiction in terms, right, these kind of mediated ideologies are specific strategies for outreach and popular mobilization. In some cases, they work. I'll give you examples in the Arab world where they worked. In other cases, they didn't. So one of the criteria at the top of the list is alignment with a social movement, remember? So what Al Jazeera did in the Arab world during a very critical period is to align themselves with the Muslim Brotherhood, a fairly strong, popular, and well entrenched and established Islamist political movement in the region. And it sounded like a pretty fantastic idea because of the popularity of the Muslim Brotherhood. Now, ironically, there was a miscalculation as well, because the adversaries of the Muslim Brotherhood were also strong, had major outreach, and also had a strong popular base. So if you put all of your eggs in one basket and that basket falls, then you don't have a horse in the race anymore. And so Al Jazeera and Qatar lost a lot of their sort of political capital when they invested all of their energies behind the social movement. Today, Al Jazeera is becoming a lot more nuanced in their way. They're like, okay, there's some leftists here, some Islamists there, some government here. There's a lot of like mixing and matching. And I think that is reflected by the government policy as well. So as Qatari foreign policy changes, so does Al Jazeera. It's never the other way around. It's never Al Jazeera taking the lead and then, the government deciding, oh yeah, based on what Al Jazeera did, that sounds like a good idea. No, the government policy changes and Al Jazeera reflects it. So when it comes to Bangladesh, the big question to ask, what is Qatari policy vis-a-vis Bangladesh? Who do the Qataris, I know it sounds cynical, right? And I'm not trying to imply this in a very conspiratorial way. It's just that media organizations serve their political interests for obvious reasons. And Al Jazeera serves a political interest. If you find yourself in the hallways of Al Jazeera, whether it's in Doha or somewhere else, you'll realize, there's some strong kind of opinions, and the people with those strong opinions happen to be situated in all the right places. There's also substantial turnover, right? Like if, for instance, you've invested substantially in Al Jazeera being like the voice of Islamist movements in the global South, and then Islamism is on a decline politically as a political force. I'm not saying Islam is a religion, of course. I'm saying Islamism as a political force is on decline. It makes sense for you to pivot in such a way so that you accommodate this transformation, this shift. If we're going through a period where there is greater kind of cosmopolitanism, where let's say in Bangladesh, like the various kind of sects, groups, denominations, religions are experiencing kind of a conciliatory relationship, then that message won't necessarily resonate. So their political ambitions in Bangladesh and in other places is actually something that is not fixed. It will change depending on circumstances. To believe that Qatar has an overarching agenda that overrides political realities is actually kind of untrue. Whether it's successful or not depends on, again, popular motivations and public opinion. In some parts of the Arab world, Al Jazeera is immensely popular because their messaging resonates. In other parts of the Arab world, their message falls flat, and in fact, the viewership of Al Jazeera is at its all-time lowest these days, And it has a lot to do with the fact that many people are cynical. They watch these like ebbs and flows and transformations. So the question of whether or not the network is authentically committed to anything is kind of gone. It withers away after a while, They try to do too much. I'll give you a great example of that. About 2 years ago, in the midst of COVID, at a time when Trump was, more than 2 years ago now, would be the last year of Trump's administration, Al Jazeera was like, wait a minute, we can't even break into the right-wing circles in the United States. So they launched a video, a video, sort of like a vlog, right? Like a video blog dedicated to young right-wing voices in the US. So like white nationalist, conservative folks in the US. If you can imagine a network that is capable of producing, relatively conservative, content in the global South or in South Asia and the Middle East and North Africa is also producing messages for conservative communities in the US. Now, of course, that program didn't last, and the reason why is because you better believe that conservative communities in the US are not going to trust Al Jazeera because the brand itself is associated with something else, right? In the same way that you need to launch a BN Sports to be able to tell yourself as a sports broadcast. So that's, whether or not Al Jazeera is successful in non-Arab countries and can resonate and produce the kind of successful, messaging that shifts things, transforms governments, has to do with the right time, the right message, the right community. So I don't know what the impact, I don't know enough about the impact of all the prime minister's men specifically. And that's something that I would be eager to learn from you about. But I can assure you that when a program like that is rubber stamped by the network, it means that there's an objective. Because you can cut out any of the, you can stop a broadcast with a button. So when it's authorized, it means it's on. Let's dance, Because otherwise you can oh, sorry, no, because some shows just disappear. I have colleagues of mine and friends of mine who have been involved with Al Jazeera and produced content that never went to air. It's just not the right thing, not the right time. So it sits there and gathers dust. So I think it's healthy to understand that everything that goes to air is a calculated decision, especially when you realize how much of a global impact it is when you're broadcasting to 180 countries, hundreds of billions of viewers. None of this is arbitrary. So, but I would be eager to learn more from all of you about how Al Jazeera is received or perceived, I should say, in Bangladesh. But thank you for that question and for the post.
I can see that Asif, you have a question that you have sent to me. So do you want me to read it out or do you want to go direct?
I can say also, Noj.
Yeah, please.
Thank you, sir, for your very detailed discussion about Al Jazeera and others. We knew little, but now it is more clear when we heard it from someone who is directly involved with Al Jazeera. And thank you to the department for that. Whenever we heard any news about South Asia, the India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, we always see this South Asia from the eye of the Western peoples, Western media. That was the reason always we find it conflicting from our point of view. In case of Arab also same thing was happening.
Yes.
And after Al Jazeera came, we sometimes always, from the beginning, we start to cross-check what Al Jazeera is saying about Arab. And we find it very different. And we that is the point from where we start to trust Al Jazeera more in case of Arab news. So do you think that Al Jazeera also has started their own channel in Al Jazeera English, Al Jazeera South Asia? They have any plan for Al Jazeera South Asia? Because South Asia have a long history with Arab countries, way back. That was my question.
Thank you so much, Asif. I appreciate that. I honestly can't speak for what Al Jazeera will do next. I think in the grand scheme of things, the Al Jazeera and the Qataris are actually back in the day, they were really interested in the global South, right? Their investments were primarily geared towards accessing the global South, communicating with the global South, getting the news from the global South to the international communities and what have you. I feel like that's less of a priority now. They are more interested in investments in the West and countering messaging about the region, these regions in the West, or more importantly, having a political, social, cultural, and economic footprint in the West. So if you follow the dime, if you will, figure out where the money is being spent, you'll see where things are headed. So Qatar is interested in major infrastructure and real estate investment in Western Europe, in the UK, in the United States, and so that is where they're putting their money. Unfortunately, the global South, whether it's South Asia, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, or even the Arab world for that matter, like their home base is of less interest to them now. So the amount of money and resources dedicated to broadcasting in Arabic is minuscule compared to the investment that they're putting in English and in other avenues. So unfortunately, we don't matter as much. Between 1996 when they launched and now, there's been kind of a sea change. Al Jazeera is closer to being a government broadcaster now than they've ever been, and they're also much more. I don't know how to put it. Like they're just a very, very kind of small, shrunken version of their previous self, and they're looking westward. They're not looking south. They're not looking east anymore. They've closed down many of their bureaus in the global south. Their offices are fewer. The staff are fewer. One could argue it's the economic crisis, but I don't think that's applicable for Qatar. They're not impacted in the same way at all. Quite the contrary. In fact, there's nothing that generates more money now than natural gas. So it's a very, very strange time. So their GDP is increasing. They're getting wealthier and more powerful, and with greater influence. But the political landscape is changing, and their priorities are changing. So I don't see a dedicated channel in the region on the horizon. And sorry, that's kind of a very muted response. But I think they would appreciate the appreciation. They would enjoy hearing that their work is well received. But I think that's kind of where it's at. So again, I don't have I'm not an oracle. I can't see into the future, but I suspect that Al Jazeera will slowly shift in such a way so as to kind of almost disperse and become different networks with different motivations. So kind of like that, what I described. So a right-wing station here, a left-wing station there. So almost like a conglomeration, right? And a conglomeration basically means that you want to kind of monopolize all the different political perspectives in the global kind of broadcasting sphere. So there was a time where Al Jazeera wanted to buy out Telesur, which is a left-leaning conglomeration of journalistic communities in Latin America. It was based in Venezuela and Brazil and Uruguay, and I think Costa Rica for some time. But Al Jazeera was like, okay, that's kind of interesting. It's a leftist station broadcasting in Latin America. Let's buy them. And they didn't, right? For whatever reason. I think it wasn't going to be a particularly successful move because the left has also been in decline in Latin America. So a lot of this has to do with political decision-making and political pivoting, What Al Jazeera, let me just say something that I think I've missed out on. I've talked about the politics, but I haven't talked about the craft, journalistic craft. I think one of the things that counts in Al Jazeera's favor is the fact that many of its journalists are really stellar professionals. And by that, I mean people who are dedicated to really pushing the boundaries, going out of their way, working extremely hard, uncovering, stories, investigations, like really just they're committed passionately to the things that they want to do, and they pursue them meticulously, and they're very hardworking. And at the same time, this is a moment in global journalism where nobody has money. So Al Jazeera has the deepest pockets of any broadcaster, You know, everybody's running out of money, so Al Jazeera is the only employer left on the global scene. So the competition for positions at Al Jazeera is very, very intense. And in addition to that, there is kind of a race to who's going to come up with like the best editing, the best production, the best, cinematography. Because I mean, when you watch all the prime minister's men, you're just like, my goodness, this is like, captivating. It's captivating to watch. You're like, oh my God, and the graphics and the CGI, like what is going on? It's really, really high quality production. There's some like animated sequences and stuff like that. So when you see that, it's obvious that there's money, and resources on one end, but there's also expertise and attention to detail and meticulousness to do it, and a real clever kind of narrative arc in developing it. You guys are involved in like TV production and journalism and film as well. So you kind of see how these things develop. So it's becoming a real refined craft on Al Jazeera. And when you have unlimited amounts of money, you can do things that no other broadcast can, right? And so the quality is very high. It may be politically complicated, but the quality is very high. And the people who are doing this work are deeply committed. And I think that's really fabulous. I would also, for those of you who don't know already, there's another, at a time when cable is kind of declining, there is these video news packages that I described. So one of Al Jazeera's little kind of outfits is AJ Plus. And that's available on YouTube, on Facebook, and a few other places. And AJ Plus is like short, snappy videos, real stories, things that kind of circulate widely through social media. And that's also really, really well produced. And the people who work on it are very, very professional. But they're like really great, minuscule interventions that kind of poke at an issue in a very compelling and intriguing way. So all this to say that I think, the direction is going to be more digital, more dispersed, more kind of disaggregated. But at the end of the day, the only true litmus test for what will end up on Al Jazeera is not unlike every and all other networks. What is consistent with the political message of the funders and the owners? So for those of you who are interested in the political economy of communication, which really this is the bedrock of what I'm kind of describing here, that we spend so much time talking about, the minutia of who said what, where, when, but the underlying, the undergirding kind of situation is the structure in place. And the structure in place is that slide that I told you, that you've got a very, very wealthy country with deep resources and a political project. And as that political project shifts, so does the programming. If it shifts the other way, you'll see the programming follow suit. Sometimes Bangladesh is not necessarily the centerpiece of their attention. So sometimes, and that can be a blessing actually. If you're not in the eye of the storm, it's a blessing because it allows you to get complicated, nuanced coverage that's here and there and everywhere. The moment that you become a centerpiece, then you become kind of a unipolar kind of story. Like that's the case, for instance, in Egypt. Al Jazeera became so obsessed with Egypt that they dedicated 80% of their coverage to Egypt. And when they did that, they picked a party, they went for it, and they failed. And so now to kind of reconcile and work through that is very difficult. But in places like Bangladesh, sometimes it's advantageous to be on the fringe because that way you get to see more intriguing stuff. So I find that Al Jazeera's coverage of Bangladesh is actually much more interesting than their coverage of India. India, it seems to me like they've picked their party and that's what they're doing. They're like, okay, Muslim oppressed minority, this is our storyline, we're going to stick with it, and it's going to be that way from now until Modi leaves, if he ever leaves, right? And then if he leaves, that's okay. That's our political line, right? But Bangladesh, no, it's more complicated. It's very interesting. What I would like to see from Al Jazeera, if there's a lot of courage, I assure you the journalists are very courageous, but if there's courage at the very top, is stories about the treatment of Bangladeshi workers in the Gulf. That would be an amazing story. And not only is that story doable, it is in their backyard. They have to walk about 2 kilometers away from their headquarters to cover that story. The mistreatment of South Asians, not just Bangladeshis, but South Asians in the region. And that's a big deal, you know? And it's not just a Western story. It's not just the West saying, no. I, as someone who's lived in that region, I assure you, and some of you might know already, but for those of you who don't, there are enough testimonies, anecdotes, experiences of mistreatment of South Asian workers, and not necessarily just labor workers, but even professional workers in the Gulf. The Arab racism and discrimination leveled against South Asian persons is something quite abhorrent and really deserves coverage. And that would be very courageous. But thus far, I haven't seen a single solid report from any broadcaster in the Arab world. I'm not just critiquing Al Jazeera. It's a blind spot, and it's an intentional blind spot. So yeah, that's what I'd like to do in a perfect world.
Yes, I totally agree. Like, for example, many of us have just restrained ourselves from watching the World Cup, because regarding the stadium, a number of like hundreds of Bangladeshi workers actually had to die for that particular stadium. So yeah, so if you do not have any other questions, we will just ask the name of the cat and leave.
Her name is Oyster. Just to answer.
Oh, Oyster, such a cute name. So yeah, Mohammad Faisal Chaudhry, he's an alumni of the department, and right now he's pursuing his PhD in QUT, Queensland University of Technology in Australia. Yeah.
A beautiful place to be.
Thanks a lot, Adel, for your very insightful and informative presentation. I thoroughly enjoyed it, and I think that I have a clear mapping of how Al Jazeera evolved over the years from a presentation. So I just had a query about the comparison between BBC and Al Jazeera, because I think there is a strong similarity if we consider their business model, because both of these services are supported by the government. In case of BBC, maybe it is directly supported by the taxpayers' money, but in case of Al Jazeera, maybe the government is not earning from the tax, but again, they are earning from the national natural resources. As you mentioned, it's a very oil-rich and gas-rich country. But there is a inherent difference between the political system. We know that Britain has a more functioning democratic system, but in case of Qatar, we have illiberal democratic situation in case of Qatar. So my question is, do you think that this political status, this status of democracy, is one of the factors that stands in the way of Al Jazeera to establish its credibility and trustworthiness across continents?
I really like that question. You know what's really funny? I'm really glad you're asking that question, because as I'm pondering it, I'm trying to imagine a scenario where Qatar democratizes, and then as a result of this democratization, there are repercussions for the broadcasting structure and the platform. But my imagination isn't taking me there, so I can't even visualize it in the practical sense. But having said that, I think for a non-democratic country or an illiberal, authoritarian kind of state, it's done really well for itself. If you think about it, it's done well economically. Its international impact is substantial. Its investments are such that it can get, countries, including its own adversaries, to get in line and sort of succumb to its political will. So in a sense, and they've also recruited some of the top journalists around the world to work for them because they've got the means to employ them. They've also produced some of the top kind of award-winning journalistic works in the world, like the number of Peabodys and Edward R. Murrows and Pulitzers, like so many awards that Al Jazeera has kind of racked up over the years. So they've done really well despite being a non-democratic state. Had had Qatar been democratic, then obviously the current structure of Al Jazeera is not sustainable. You can't continue to support it in this way if there is scrutiny, public scrutiny of some sort. In this case, there actually is no public. If you think about it practically, Al Jazeera has no public, meaning that its public exists outside the borders of the country from which it broadcasts. It doesn't in any way report on Qatar except to promote the actions of the head of state. But beyond that, its audiences, those who have an affinity for it or those who have acrimony towards it, they're all outside. There these populations like in Australia or here in Canada or in Bangladesh, this is like dispersed publics, right? So those dispersed public, if they knew that Al Jazeera, that Qatar is more democratic, then it would help us reconcile with our discomfort with it. You know what I mean? Like, I think I would be more comfortable and more at ease with their coverage if I knew that it was authentic, that it was informed by a deliberative process, that there is a public that scrutinizes it in some ways. The BBC, like CBC, like many other public broadcasters, there is public scrutiny, not just in funding, but you can say, if you don't like what you see, the government has to answer to it, right? That's the public, or at least that's the idealized way of dealing with kind of public broadcasting. In the case of Al Jazeera, it doesn't matter what they do. If tomorrow they decide to side with Donald Trump to support his candidacy for the elections, what's going to happen? You're going to boycott Al Jazeera? Boycott Al Jazeera. What does it do to Al Jazeera? Nothing. They have nothing to lose. They have nothing to lose because if you stop watching them, they don't lose any money. You know why? Because they don't make money from their broadcast. It's a very kind of bizarre dynamic. It's a public-private, centralized, decentralized media system that is capable of surviving any and all circumstances because it is bankrolled by unlimited amounts of resources, And so our opinion as members of the public literally does not matter. And as far as the population of Qataris, they constitute less than 20% of their own country's population. And they are too well off to even care what's on Al Jazeera. Many of them don't even follow Al Jazeera. You know why? Because it doesn't cover their country. You know what I mean? Like
Yes.
the percentage of coverage of Al Jazeera about Qatar is less than 3%. So imagine that, like if BBC were to cover the UK with only 3% of their dedicated coverage, or Bangladeshi, private or public broadcaster with only 3% of its coverage focused on Bangladesh, you wouldn't call it the Bangladeshi broadcaster, So they're not accountable to anyone. The only accountability is to the funder, and that funder is the head of state.
Right. Because you also mentioned that, Al Jazeera, they have a very strong financial support from the government. Maybe it's as good as BBC or better than that. But still.
High. Yeah.
Exactly.
Infinitely high. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, Faisal. So I think it's already quite late. So we'll just take one more question, which is from our moderator, one of our moderators, Mukarram Rana. So Rana, that's the last question, I promise, Adel. Yeah.
Thanks, Mel. My question is Al Jazeera playing a role to promote liberal values in Muslim majority countries as it defends LGBTQ rights? And if Qatar controls Al Jazeera's editorial policy, how this position of supporting LGBTQ rights is maintained as homosexuality is banned in Qatar?
Okay. Oof, wow, that's a very good question. Okay, I'm gonna answer it in a roundabout way. I'm sure you followed the coverage of the World Cup, right? So with the coverage of the World Cup, you had Western countries kind of focusing on human rights violations and LGBTQ rights, et cetera, right? And of course, the Qatari government, before the World Cup, was saying, no, so long as they don't do anything here, it's going to be totally fine. Like there's that sort of dynamic, right? Kind of a weird, opaque position. And then once the World Cup unfolded, the Qatari government and the local kind of the state broadcasters and Al Jazeera, they all took a fairly kind of staunch response, which is to say, you know, it's banned, no flags allowed, blah blah blah. This is the way, you know, they dug their heels deeper and they positioned themselves as conservative, you know, Muslim, you know, homophobic or whatever it is. They're just like, no, not welcome, not here. Don't impose your values on us. That was the position, right? And then they also criticized Western government and Western news organizations for focusing excessively on LGBTQ rights. Okay. Now, an interesting exercise, if you were to rewind 4 years prior, the World Cup that precedes that was in Russia. And the Russian government, ironically or interestingly, also had, under Putin specifically, also has a fairly hostile position in relation to LGBTQ rights. Now, because the Qatari government at the time was a strong opposition to the Russians, because Russia was an ally and continues to be an ally for Bashar al-Assad and the Syrian regime, whereas Qatar is a supporter of the opposition in Syria, they were dedicated to criticizing the Russian government and the Russian World Cup every chance that they could. So if you were just for fun, you could just Google Al Jazeera LGBTQ Russia, and it'll pull up entire articles published on Al Jazeera criticizing Russia for being hostile to LGBTQ persons during the World Cup. You see what I mean? So all this to say that LGBTQ rights for Al Jazeera, as is the case for many other news organizations, unfortunately, has less to do with the rights of those communities and more to do with how these rights are weaponized against their adversaries. So Al Jazeera actually has a lot of footage. You probably already know this. Al Jazeera has a lot of footage in the US going into conservative communities and how LGBTQ, like how homophobic many of those communities are, and just expose them like, look at these rallies, look at these Trump rallies and how hostile these people are to queer individuals, how problematic that is. So they present that. And so you think, oh, it must mean that Al Jazeera supports the rights of LGBTQ rights because they're criticizing the people who are hostile towards them. But then you shift the frame and you look at how things are addressed in the Arab world or the Muslim majority countries, and it's the polar opposite. It's like, these are our cultural norms. This is our sensitivities. Don't come telling us what to do and what not to do. And so what I'm trying to suggest is that because Al Jazeera is trying to reach so many different audiences, and those audiences are different from each other, it's exactly like having two sides of a coin, right? The coin on one side will never see the coin on the other side, right? Like if you hold a coin, that side will never see that side. They're back to back, okay? And so that's how they design their broadcasting. You face this way, you face this way. English language network broadcasts here, Arabic language broadcasts here. Turkish one goes here, Balkans here. And they're just in opposition to each other. But because we are living in the 21st century, it's 2023, and we all have access to everything, and everything's translated or subtitled or dubbed or whatever, we all can see this, quite frankly. We can see how the same broadcaster is capable of producing conflictual messages in different places for different audiences. So it raises the question of what is truly authentic. In the case of the World Cup in Qatar, they were defending or protecting their own, the sanctity of their own traditions in the eyes of their own conservative communities. But elsewhere, they are protecting the interests of communities that they want to serve. You see what I mean? So it's complicated, but I don't think that Al Jazeera or Qatar are authentically committed in any way, shape, or form to supporting LGBTQ rights. Quite the contrary. I think if anything, when they state or advocate or support LGBTQ rights, it is simply to target their political adversaries, such as in Russia or the United States or other places. Like, oh, look, you're homophobic, you know? And that's it. Sorry, that's kind of long-winded, but that would be my. Actually, Gopa, can I ask a quick question?
Sure.
If they, I don't think we've heard from any women. Are there any women who might have any questions? I mean, I'm not suggesting that I can
Yes.
identify everybody's gender, but
Sure.
and no
Kotha
pressure.
and Shaolin. We have two female respondents right here. So do you have any question for our guest today, Kotha? Kotha actually had an interesting question that she was formulating about your contextual objectivity regarding that. So if we can have Kotha today with us.
Yes, ma'am. Ma'am, good evening, sir.
Good evening.
Takia Monawara Kotha. That we all know that good media is often considered as a people's watchdog that acts as a mechanism for the prevention and investigation of allegations of violations or malpractice in general. How well do you think Al Jazeera has served the role of a watchdog for the public, both internationally and regionally?
Thank you so much. So the watchdog role, I think Al Jazeera has done a really fantastic job being the watchdog for everyone else's country except Qatar. So they basically, it's like everybody outsources their watchdog role to Al Jazeera. So they can be a watchdog for the government in Bangladesh and in Egypt and in Syria and in Japan and all these different places. And that's a wonderful thing. Like we're all looking for oppositional media, and our state media is very much centralized. And once a political force comes to power, they consolidate power by controlling the media. So Al Jazeera is this island capable, or peninsula capable of producing oppositional narratives for all of us. And so we get drawn to it, and we're like, yeah, let's go. Let's hear this. I'm looking for something oppositional. I can't find it. Oh, Al Jazeera's got it. Thank you. So they are doing a really fantastic job playing the watchdog role for so many different countries' publics, but they don't do it at home. And I think that is a very critical blunder, if you will, because it's necessary to demonstrate your authentic commitment to that watchdog role. And if you can't do it in-house, can't do it in your backyard, if you can't, it's sort of like that kind of famous adage, like those with glass homes shouldn't throw stones or something like that. And others, I've forgotten what the proper way of saying it is, but you know what I'm trying to say. Like if you live in a glass home, you don't throw stones. And it's kind of like that, it's sort of like they're living in a glass house and they're not just throwing stones, they've got like a machine gun of rocks. And they're just like, what? Literally, they're just like, there isn't a country on the planet that they don't go after except for their allies. I think in general, for instance, they're very soft on Turkey, especially with Erdogan in power. There are countries that they're kind of soft on, right? It's not really a watchdog role in that regard. But overall, I think their commitment to the betterment of publics is something that is salient in some countries at the expense of others, Yeah, there are some cases, like it's really actually quite funny because it is most evident in situations where you've got countries that are very similar to them, but they consider adversarial. So the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia, for at least 3 years, because they were very angry with them, they would cover stories about how migrant workers are abused there. Like all the things that you could be doing in-house, you're doing outside. You're like, oh, look at how they're treating the miserable migrant workers. Like, what about the ones who are working for your news organization? What about like the staff of your news organization? Why aren't they the ones being covered? Anyway, so the watchdog role is one that again, like anything else that they do, is politically motivated. Not just them. Again, I want to clarify that when I talk about Al Jazeera, it is a case study. It is a case study in how media function in light of political economic structures, investment, funding, ownership, and centralization of power. So it is not exceptional, but most of the decisions around the role, the watchdog role, are determined on the basis of political motivations. Easier to fund and support watchdogs abroad. I mean, another great example of that is Indian media's coverage of countries that they don't like. You know, it's like, okay, they're watchdogs somewhere else, but not home. You know, Bangladeshi media is really fantastic at covering, you know, the problems that are somewhere else. You know, Pakistan or India or other places, but domestically, you're like, no, we've got this. So Al Jazeera is no different from anyone else. It's just that they're doing our bidding, you know, because we don't have our own media. But eventually, you know, a lot of people are like, oh, you know, why aren't you covering yourself? Go cover yourself. And when they don't have an answer to that, they're like, okay, you're not real anymore, you know. But anyway, it's an important question. I thank you for raising it. We always have to keep that exercise going, like who's covering what, where, and why, and whose interests are being served by this coverage. So even though the coverage could be stellar, the media critic and the media literate are ones who ask the difficult questions. And sometimes it puts you in a position where you're at odds with very informed, intellectually minded individuals in your own family and the people that you know around you, because they believe that they know. And you're like, you know what? It's a little bit more complicated than that. And then you become very unpopular at home. But that's okay. You just like, you know, just the moment that you begin to make it seem a little bit more complicated, you're onto something.
Thank you so much. We enjoyed the talk thoroughly. And now it's just a formality, like our colleague Shaolin Shaun would just come up with her thank you note. Thank you very much, Shaolin. Please go ahead.
Thank you, ma'am. I want to thank and express my gratitude to everyone who has been a part of this beautiful online session. Our Honorable Chairman, sir, our Gopa ma'am, and most importantly, Mr. Adel Iskandar, thank you so much for joining us, for explaining all the difficult things in a simple way, for staying up so late and explaining these answers to all. Thank you so much, sir. I would love to wish you good luck in Bengali, which is like অনেক অনেক শুভকামনা আপনার জন্য বাংলাদেশে আসবেন. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Shaolin. I really appreciate
She just
that.
promised to buy you tickets worth like $500. Yeah.
A ticket to Dhaka?
Yes.
Okay, great. I'll take it. Thank you. No, that's very, very kind of you. Thank you, Shaolin, for your kind words. I'm really very much humbled to be in your presence. I would have loved to be there in person. Hopefully sometime on the horizon that can materialize. But in the meantime, I thank you for your attention. I thank you for your time. I thank you for your incisive questions. And I wish you all the very best. And I'm grateful to have been in your presence. And it's never too late to spend time with curious minds and people who are at the forefront of this really important quest to produce knowledge and to do so responsibly. So thank you for your time. And thank you, Professor Gopa, for your kind invitation.
It's a pleasure. And thank you, Byron. I'd like to thank Byron and also my team who has worked really hard to do all these things. Thank you, Byron. That's so sweet of you to write this message. Yeah, it's very cute. Thank you. So yeah, a very good night to Byron, Adel, and Oyster. Yeah, thank you. Bye.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Byron.
Bye-bye.
Take care. Have a great morning. Day. Bye. Bye.